Hello everyone, I'm Paris Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to 12 O'Clock High, a podcast on business leadership with Tom Fox, hosted by Richard Lummis.
Hello and welcome to another episode of 12 O'Clock High, a podcast about leadership. It's Richard Lummis. I'm here with Tom Fox for another discussion on how to improve our leadership skills. We believe leadership is a skill which can be improved with study of both good and bad practices, and we try to draw interesting examples from many sources, including history, fiction, film, and business writing. Welcome back, Tom.
Thank you, Richard.
Today we're going to talk about one of my least favorite aspects of our current system of government: grandstanding congressmen and senators elbowing each other for microphone time to talk about something they know little about while trying to browbeat some poor witnesses. In this case, however, it's very difficult to have much sympathy for the witness. I'm referring to Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook and his recent 2 days of congressional testimony. The role of social media in general and Facebook in particular are not topics we've discussed in any detail before. This seems like a good time to address some of those issues. Tom, I know you have a presence on social media that you found helpful, but you also have some observations about these hearings in particular. Where would you like to start?
Well, Richard, actually, I appreciated this version of congressional theater more than, certainly I think you did, but also more than some of the more recent examples. And since this podcast is about leadership, we'll try to really stay away from the political side of things. But I was most interested in whether or not Zuckerberg would be able to respond in a way that not necessarily generated sympathy for he or Facebook, but actually helped set an agenda. And if I could contrast it with the Wells Fargo's hearings of former CEO John Stumpf, which we have talked about on this podcast, we were both, I think, very dismayed with the tone of that political theater, and it was simply just a browbeating with Stumpf sitting there taking it. Zuckerberg came very well prepared, or I should step back and say there's some key leadership lessons, and that's why I wanted to talk about it, starting with the fact that he came very well prepared, not with a script, but with a plan. And to me, for a leader at that level of a leader who's going to have to go in front of a congressional committee, I think a key lesson learned here is to come with a plan. Now, I understand that every battle plan exists until the first shot is fired. Nevertheless, this is a lot different, I think, that you can try and stick to your plan. Now, Elizabeth Warren was not browbeating him, and perhaps there were some other differences, but Zuckerberg came with a real plan in place. And some of the things that he did, where you may disagree with him from the theater aspect, I thought from the leadership aspect, they were things that we could really talk about. The first one was he apologized. He apologized, he apologized, he apologized, and he apologized. That's typically, we see typically one apology. The Japanese will give us a deep bow, but he opened his answers with either Mr. Senator or Ms. Senator, or I'm sorry. And I think that went a long way towards helping humanize him, because many of us had not really heard him speak anywhere other than a canned presentation. So he came forward and was humble. And I think that's important, and it's certainly to the political theater portion of it, I thought was important. He was not arrogant, to my mind, in any way. Second of all, he talked about sacrifices. And, perhaps that's too strong a word, but sacrifices in terms of clearly Facebook is willing to give up a few things. Facebook understands that for their own future, they cannot continue with the same business model that they have succeeded fabulously well on. They have to move to something different. That something different may be a business business model that will require pay, but it also may, I think, certainly require more regulatory oversight. And it doesn't cost him anything to say we're willing to accept regulatory oversight, because In Europe, on May 25, there's a law called the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, which comes into force, which Facebook will be covered by. And so for him to say we're willing to do something less than that, he's not giving anything up. And all of Facebook in Europe is subject to it. They may decide as a corporate response that they're going to comply with it on a worldwide basis. Well, if you're going to make that concession internally, you can certainly say to a senator, we're willing to accept your guidance on regulations. So he came with a sacrifice. Whether it was meaningful, meaningless, it still, I thought, helped his position.
Let me jump in right
Sure.
there and say that what I think is going to happen is, given the total cluelessness of the congressman questioning him, I think that he thinks that he's going to be able to shape those regulations to Facebook's benefit.
That may well be true, and that's certainly a big part of what I saw in this round of political theater was a generational gap that I had not seen between our ruling class, our political class, and the business class. When I had seen a Jamie Dimon, when I'd seen a John Stump, when I'd seen a you name the CEO, I saw generally a white male, although it could have been a female, certainly the CEO of GM or African American male, but and they were typically in their 50s or 60s. Obviously, Mark Zuckerberg is not that, and much younger, and a complete disconnect of knowledge by our political class of being able to ask questions. Now, some of the senators, they had, I think, 3 minutes to ask questions, so it's hard to screw something up within 3 minutes, but and they were given, I thought, some at least decent questions to ask. But on the regulatory writing, in addition to the very good point you raised that Facebook may well be able to lobby and shape those regs, you have a certain sector or segment of our political class that doesn't believe regulations should come into play anyway. So he might just be able to depend on the inability of our Congress to get anything done. But even if he does that, once again, I fall back to, in Europe, they're going to be required to do this. And the administrative hassle of having a carve-out for the world's most stringent regulatory scheme regarding certainly data privacy, data protection, I think would mandate that Facebook have something in place that would get them close to that if they don't go full bore on it. But once again, but as to your point that he made a concession that may be meaningless, but it still came across as a concession. Yeah. And that's something that I think a leader should take forward. One of the things that he was advised to do was answer tough questions. I'm not sure he did that, but what I'm sure he said was, my team will get back to you. My team will get back to you. That was his third most favorite phrase. And he did it in a way that didn't sound like he was brushing it off. It sounded like he didn't know the answer to it. Now, I did find some of his answers disingenuous. Nevertheless, he was able to answer, give a response to tough questions in a meaningful way or meaningful enough that the senators and representatives accepted. He certainly stayed on message, and we know that because he conveniently left his talking points on his desk, which a news reporter conveniently or accidentally photographed with her iPhone. So we knew what his talking points were, at least from the first day. So we haven't really had, I thought, a positive showcase from one of these, just as you've said, theater hearings. But I think Zuckerberg gave us a few points that every CEO should consider if, heaven forbid, they get into that imbroglio of having to do this.
Yeah. Well, I think that's correct. I think one of the things that struck me about this whole disaster is that Zuckerberg and his CEO Sheryl Sandberg both went radio silent for what I thought was way too long a period.
Yes.
And part of that is I think they're not completely sure what they're doing. They had to revise the numbers of users whose data had been exposed to Cambridge Analytica from 50 million to 87 million, which is a fairly significant error.
Yes. One of the things we've talked about in prior podcasts are when should a essentially tech startup put policies and procedures in place just like a real adult corporation. And it's pretty clear that although Facebook is a real adult corporation, they don't have those policies and procedures in place. They're not able to draw upon this. One of the most damning things to me was that Cambridge Analytica and Facebook swapped terms and conditions, and they were different. And Facebook says you can't release our data to any other parties, and the Cambridge Analytica terms and conditions say that we may take your data and either sell or send it to third parties. On Facebook's side of the equation, their response was that they have so many vendors that they have artificial intelligence reviewing the terms and conditions, and that AI didn't pick it up. So clearly a process failure by Facebook, which points to, and hopefully that ties into your point, that they don't really know what their numbers are. They have grown so fast and they are so large that they need to spend some time sort of digesting this and putting the processes and procedures in place to enable them to answer those types of questions.
Well, I think the other thing that happened was that a lot of the data was not Facebook user data.
Yes.
It was data that Facebook users had on their phone or in their computer that was scraped up by Facebook as part of their terms and conditions. So who is that data? If you have my contact information, including, say, my birthday on your calendar, and Facebook scrapes that up, even if I'm not a Facebook user, they've got it. And I think that's part of the thing that nobody has really focused on till now. And then when you see some of the abuses that it's been subject to, I think people are worried, as they should be.
I absolutely agree. And I guess cynical me had thought we didn't have much of any privacy anyway. But what
correctly
this entire exercise pointed out just how little we have. And to your point that if you and I are friends on Facebook and Cambridge Analytica had my data, they had full access to your data. And they had full access to your friends' data. And so it exponentially grew out in a way that no one had really thought about. And if we can start having those discussions, I don't know if we can put the genie back in the bottle, but we can certainly have a discussion around along the lines of the Europeans have had on their GDPR regulation. So the discussions can be had if there's a political will to install it or installate it. That's not a word. It can be done, and whether we'll have that debate at the highest levels of government, I don't know, or whether you'll just have to disclose that yes, this ad is bought and paid for by the Russian Communist Party. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I look forward to that disclosure. I guess one of the other things that popped up in my reading was that there is a consent decree with the Federal Trade Commission.
Yes.
That Facebook had entered, prohibiting them from allowing third parties unrestricted access to data, which they've sure have violated in several million cases, at up to $40,000 per violation.
Yes. So that story brought up two different tracks of thought for me. The first was to play out on the slippery slope that you just named, which is I think the potential liability was $60 billion if it was $40,000 for every violation. The second thing is the complete, utter, and total inability of the Federal Trade Commission to regulate this area. And when you read about a violation, not from a whistleblower, not from a self-disclosure by a company, but in some blog post, that really does not speak very well to your regulatory oversight body. And the FTC, I think, is woefully inadequate to engage in this type of regulation.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to bring them up to speed, though. They certainly can't afford to pay them as well as Facebook and Google and so forth. So.
But I really thought that there was a lot, like I said, the reason I wanted to visit on this was this is not, John Stump from Wells Fargo. This is not Tony Hayward from BP. This was a CEO who was well prepared. He's obviously very smart. The commentary beforehand, maybe it was trying to lower expectations, but it was basically that he doesn't do well in public speaking where he's not scripted. Certainly he was not scripted, but he was prepared. And I found that refreshing to have a CEO who was prepared and answered questions when he clearly could have fallen quite on his face. What did we? I think in one of our prior podcasts we talked about the loss of value to Facebook was several billion over this time period, and indeed the stock market went down, I think, about 6%, largely based on tech stocks. So there's a lot at stake here, and a lot for the rarefied CEO who gets put in this position, but I think a fair amount to consider.
Well, I think one of the other things that struck me was the Sheryl Sandberg piece on NPR, where she says things like, we were way too idealistic, we didn't think about the abuse process. So I'm wondering if you think that there's a bit of groupthink going on in Silicon Valley that made them blind to this problem.
You think?
Yeah.
Here we are sitting in the energy capital of the world, and we engage in groupthink. Surely not those hotshot tech people. Actually, that's certainly, I think, a very fair question, and a very not troubling question, but one that Silicon Valley needs to look at itself in the mirror. But the point I wanted to explore with you on Sheryl Sandberg is she, in many ways, in her public comments, particularly the ABC interview, struck me that she went beyond what Zuckerberg admitted, and such things as, we were lax. Yeah. We made mistakes. And I was wondering if that is it was clearly part of their strategy, but you have a very photogenic, very well thought of, after her most recent book about losing her husband, sympathetic figure in Sheryl Sandberg, yes. And being the adult in the room, saying these sorts of things very matter-of-factly, and no one's criticizing her for it. No one's saying, why didn't you say this before? They're saying, thank you for sharing that with us now. And so I'm wondering if that was obviously part of the strategy, but was that strategy unique to having a Sheryl Sandberg in that place at that time, or is that something that corporations could consider?
Well, I think you're right that she is uniquely positioned as a sympathetic figure right now. But I also think that you're right, having a photogenic female. As you said, most of these people have been 50, 60-something white males in $1,500 or $5,000 suits. So yeah, I think it does make a difference that she's given more of a hearing and given a little more leeway.
Well, it was sort of, for me anyway, fascinating theater. I watched as much of it as I could. There was some substance there. There will be hopefully some real discussion about privacy and data protection regulation in this country. But as we found out, or at least I discovered, some leadership lessons that I think are worthy talking about.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure we will have many other opportunities to discuss grandstanding congressional hearings. But for now, this is Richard Lomas and Tom Fox with 12 O'Clock High.
This is Paris Fox again. We hope you enjoyed this episode of 12 O'Clock High, a podcast on business leadership with Tom Fox. If you enjoyed the show, please go to iTunes and rate the podcast. Thank you for listening.